Hello, welcome to the episode of the Let People Prosper Show. My name is Dr. Vance Gann. Thank you for joining us here today. We're going to have a great discussion with my friend, happy warrior, and just overall good guy, Dr. Robert Lawson. Bob, welcome to the show.
Hi, Vance. Good to be here.
Great. We're recording this on September 27th, and we're going to have a good discussion on a lot of things: economic freedom, Socialism Sucks, a good book that Bob wrote with his co-author, Ben Powell, and a few other things. But let me go over his bio first. Dr. Bob Lawson holds the Fullinwider Chair in Economic Freedom, and he directs the Bridwell Institute for Global Freedom Institute there at SMU. He is also a founding co-author of the widely cited Economic Freedom, the World Index, and has written more than 100 academic articles, book chapters, policy reports, and book reviews. So we just wanted to jump right into this and have a good discussion today, Bob. Let's start off with, why do you do what you do? What motivates you?
Well, Vance, I have a flippant answer and a somewhat serious answer. The flippant answer is, I grew up in a working class family. We weren't living on the streets, but we didn't have a lot of money. And I started working outside the home, doing odd jobs, painting apartments, scraping the insides of pools. And I decided, as I grew up, I became a bartender, waiter. I decided I didn't really like working for a living, and I saw that college professors didn't seem to work really hard, so I decided I want to be a college professor. That's the flip answer, but it does have a grain of truth. But the real serious answer is, I went to Ohio University in Athens, Ohio, and I studied with a guy named Richard Vedder, and I just fell in love with economics. And really, since I was 18 years old, from my very first economics course in college, I have wanted to do nothing else but do and talk about economics, and it's a dream job, and I feel lucky to have it.
Well, I always enjoy listening to you when you're talking about economics, and you really do get into it, into the details. And one of the things that I really like that you do is this teaching free enterprise across the state of Texas, but other states as well, really trying to teach teachers about free enterprise. Would you mind explaining a little bit about what you do there?
Yeah, sure. About 5-6 years ago, we started this Teaching Free Enterprise program. And what we do is we have college faculty and other PhDs, people like yourselves, Vance, and we write curriculum units, little modules, and they're designed to be for school teachers, mostly high school teachers, to take these modules, these little units that we've developed, and use them in their classrooms. And, it's a little bit unfair because there's some really, really good economics teachers at the high school level in the state of Texas and around the country. But we also know that the reality is quite a few people who are ended up teaching economics at the high school level are, it's the track coach. Mm-hmm. And they're very passionate about they do a good job, but they don't have a lot of training necessarily in economics. And so we wanted to kind of create these sort of turnkey units that you could just hand deliver to them. We do workshops all over the state of Texas and really now throughout the country. Without exaggeration, now hundreds, sometimes into the thousands of teachers each year will go through our programs. And, we're just trying to elevate the quality of curriculum materials that they have at their disposal.
Well, it's really a great program for the listeners. Just to check it out, I'll put it in the show notes page, a link to it as well. But there's just so much good information, and it's interesting too because recently I went to Beaumont and taught some teachers, and was able to do one of your units, Bob, on trade. And it's not just the information, which is important. Look at what the basics of economics will tell you about trade and the importance of trade and everything else. But it's also a little bit about the math, but not a lot about the math. But what I really like about what the program does is it makes it to where it's tangible, it's interactive. So there's a trade game that goes on that shows, okay, you value a hairbrush by X and I value a pen by Y. What happens if we trade? Will our values improve? And I know in that particular instance, I think there were 10 teachers that were in there, kind of split them up into different groups. And just within their own group, 5 here and 5 in another group, their values, once you started off, the average value per person increased whenever they had the exchanges. And then in the next round, kind of expanded to all 10, and the value increases it even more. And so I wonder, whenever you were thinking about putting that together, what were some of the insights that you hope to convey to the audience?
Well, it's a cliche. I teach in a business school, and it's a cliche in business schools to say trade creates value. Value creation, it's a little bit of a buzzword. But value does get created when we make trades. And that little trade game exercise is one of the greatest ways. It gets people up out of their seats. And you can just tell people trade creates value. You can assert it. But when they go through that exercise and they actually make trades, and then they try to measure the value from those trades, and they see how value grows after the trades, it really reinforces that point. I mean, we know from pedagogy research that active learning, it works better. Now, it's awfully hard to make some things active learning. Like it's calculus. It's hard to make calculus active learning. I mean, it's calculus. Yeah. But whenever you have a chance to teach about a concept to students, or in this case, we're teaching teachers, and you can make it active. You can get them up out of their seats. They're gonna, whatever the concept is you're trying to teach, it'll get reinforced much more strongly than if they're sitting passively writing notes in a notebook.
Well, that's right. And I know in the other unit that you have as part of Teaching for Enterprise is a labor market. That's the one that I wrote, where we do a minimum wage game. Where kind of some are employers, some of the class will be employers, some of the class will be employees, and they have different reservation wages, what they're willing to reserve their labor for in order to work, whatever that wage has to be. And you kind of go through in the first system, a free enterprise system with no minimum wage, and the average wage, it typically is around $10, just the way that the game is put together. And I'll come in and say, okay, that's not a living wage. You can't live off of $10 an hour. I'm going to be the government, which is kind of, I don't want to be, but but that's what I say. I'm going to be the government. I'm going to come in. I'm going to mandate a living wage of $15, a minimum wage. It's going to be a price floor, so you can teach about the price floor as well. And I do it all again. And what you notice is that those employers that would hire maybe 2 workers before will only end up hiring 1 because it's more profitable that way. And so you see more people who are unemployed in the marketplace. And in the last session, I kind of go through and say, okay, what if there's not a minimum wage, but there's increased productivity, there's increase in skills. And so the marginal revenue from the firm side starts to go up from each time. And so now more people are not only employed, but they get a higher wage. And so instead of the average wage going from $10 to $15, now the average wage is around $12, but everybody has a job that kind of wants one in that sort of situation. And I think this sort of interactive approach is really what we need more of. Because I know whenever I was teaching at like Sam Houston or Texas Tech for a while and doing this game, just the light bulbs would start going on. And I know you saw with that one. What's another game that you like to do?
Well, besides the trade game, one of my favorite, it's not even a game, but I could pan over up here on my shelf over here. I've got a set of lawn darts. And you remember lawn darts, the old game?
Yeah.
You throw the metal spikes through the air. It got banned in 1986. I'm not even sure you were around in 1986, Vance.
Barely, yeah.
And I'm teaching about risk and return and safety and the trade-offs. And again, it's standard economics, trade-offs. We're always trading off one value for another. Sometimes we trade off our safety. Every time you get in a car, you trade off your safety in order to achieve some objective. And that's a lecture. You can do that as a lecture, but I like to use lawn darts, and it's a visual. And a lot of students today have never seen lawn darts. And you pull this metal spike out of the air and you wave it around in the classroom and you pretend you're going to throw it at them and they all recoil. I mean, again, it's not a game, but it makes that classroom experience. And every time they think about seatbelts or other safety things, the discussion we all have about, helmet laws for motorcyclists, whatever, they're going to remember, that JART lecture, it gives their brain an anchor point that they don't really get just from a straight lecture. No,
it's so true. And I mean, there's a lot of things too that go into that we could probably build on, because you got your PhD at Florida State, right?
Yes, sir. Go Seminoles.
There you go. I think one of the things that is talked a lot about in economics is, positive economics, using a lot of math. And I think that's important to a certain degree, but it also goes into the assumptions that are in these models. That's kind of the institutional framework that I think a lot of us as economists, think about. But there are a lot of different institutional frameworks that are out there. You've got Keynesian school and New Keynesian and all these different types of schools. And I wonder what kind of your thoughts are on the math that's involved in these different types of schools of economics.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a sad reality that to study economics at the advanced level now, you need to be pretty much a mathematician. I mean, it's not an exaggeration to say that you need more math to get a PhD in economics than you do to get a PhD in physics. And that's not a kind thing to say, really, about economics. Now, there are some. I use some math when I teach students, and I like math. I'm good at it, and I think there are some things in economics that we learn better and we learn more precisely because of using mathematics. I always use the example of comparative advantage. It's a freshman level concept. It's something you would teach like in week 2 of a principles class to freshman undergraduates. But it's not a really straightforward concept. And until you actually do like a numerical or a mathematical example, it doesn't really sink in to most people. So there are reasons to do math. Now, having said that, we've taken it way beyond what's reasonable. I mean, and I do think that we're turning out a lot of economists today who they really can't see the forest through the trees. They know the math, they're good at the math, but they really don't know economics and what really matters in the real world of economics. And when you ask, you can actually tell. You get a new PhD. This is not a kind thing to say either, but you get a new PhD, just got his or her PhD, and you ask them a real world question like about inflation and the Fed or the minimum wage, and they have a puzzled look. And the puzzled look is because they're trying to do math in their head, like, oh yeah, what's the model say? Like, you know what, you're a professional economist. You should be able to talk about inflation in the Fed. And maybe you're wrong, but you ought to be able to talk about it without a bunch of math. And unfortunately, too many people in our profession are math first, and economics comes a distant second.
Yeah. And whenever you see that happening, even today, to your point, I mean, we have a lot of people who still follow the Phillips curve. Yeah. As there's some trade-off between the unemployment rate and inflation, and if we just tweak the wheels of the economy just right, we can get it to where we want it to be.
Yeah, and it also goes to the fact that economists don't study history anymore either.
No,
we just don't. I mean, the history of the Phillips curve is a fascinating history. It was once upon believed to be dogma, and then it kind of fell off. And I think the reason it's kind of coming back in favor is because people didn't study the history of the Phillips curve debate. They don't know what Milton Friedman talked about in his 1968 presidential address. They've all forgotten that. And so it's pretty easy to fall victim again to bad ideas because you just haven't studied the history of those bad ideas and realize, oh my gosh, this is not the first time this bad idea has popped up. And but so it's like you have to re-educate every new generation. But we're doing a pretty poor job of teaching history and economics.
Yeah, well, I think with all that, and we kind of move on, but I think a big part of it, to your point, is that maybe focus a little bit less on the math and more on the history.
Yeah.
More on the principles.
I think yes. I took history of economic thought. I was one of the last students, and I was required to take an all-day exam in it. It was a core exam, and they got rid of it right after I left and replaced it with, guess what, a mathematical exam. So my own alma mater has fallen, victim to it too.
Yeah. Speaking of Milton Friedman and institutions and those sort of things, I'd like to move over now into the economic freedom of the world. And I think Milton Friedman was part of this discussion, Courtney and others. And, you've been working on this for a while now, Bob. And I think there's just so much that's being provided in the Economic Freedom of the World Index that's not only helping us understand what economic freedom kind of is and is not, but also the relationship it has with prosperity. The show, Let People Prosper, there's so much involved. And so if you would you mind giving us some background on the report and in the index and kind of some of the details about it?
Yeah, sure. So along with Jim Courtney, I helped found this thing called the Economic Freedom of the World Index. It's published by the Fraser Institute, which is a public policy think tank in Canada. And it was actually Milton Friedman's idea. And in the late 80s, and I was a high school student, so this is lore to me. It's just stories that have been passed down to my generation. But Milton Friedman and others were actually arguing amongst themselves at a conference about whether or not economic freedom was getting worse or better, whether we were moving more in the direction of capitalism or more in the direction, let's say, of socialism. And there was actually just disagreement on the fundamental fact of the matter, like which way are we going? And Milton Friedman was exasperated. He's like, well, how are we going to get anywhere in this great debate about capitalism and socialism if we don't even know where we are? We don't even know the basic trend, if it's getting better or worse. And so he came up with the idea that someone, it wasn't going to be him, but someone should do an economic freedom index that tries to measure how, on a sort of capitalism to socialism scale, where is your country? Is it more on the capitalism side of the scale, or is it more on the socialism side of the scale? And Jim Gortney, my professor, went to a conference with Milton, and he came back from that conference and ordered me to start gathering the data. And we produced our first proto-index in 1992. First real publication came out in 96, and I've been doing it every year since. We just came out just a couple weeks ago with our latest report.
Yeah, and the latest report, and it's always, the data is 2 years behind, right?
Right, yeah. So it takes about a year for the World Bank or the World Economic Forum or whoever's data I'm using. It takes about a year for them to get the data processed and published, and then it takes us about another year to get their data and put it into our computers and publish our report. So we just released the 2022 report, but the latest numbers in that report are from 2020, which of course is a pretty big year. I mean, this is the year of COVID. COVID hit the world. Maybe I should give the punchline away. It was not good.
Yes.
Man. I mean,
yeah.
The Economic Freedom Index for the world, if you want to see like the graphs going up and then going up, and then 2020, it's like just a cliff. So the world responded to the COVID crisis, not just the United States, but the whole world, by spending and regulating people's lives, spending more money, taxing more, borrowing more, and regulating. Sometimes regulating down to the detail of how many people could be in a restaurant. So the index, we became a lot less economically free because of COVID, so our index is captured that. That's, I guess, good. But it's pretty bleak picture when you look at that graph. We gave up about 10 years worth of progress in moving towards more economic freedom in the world. We gave about a decade's worth of progress.
Wow. Yeah, it is something else. And it's quite telling, those charts that you have in the report. And I'll make sure to put that in the show notes page as well. But it was dramatic. And the economic freedom, the liberty that was lost during that time is going to take a while to get back in so many ways. And one of the other things, of course, to look at, since we're in the U.S., is that we also fell from, 6th place to 7th place?
Yeah, so, I mean, the ranking didn't fall very much. Every country
Right.
went down, so the rankings didn't change much. But I think this is a good example where we should look at the ratings, not the
Right.
rankings. But yeah, the U.S. is down. We've been in the middle single digits now for a while. If you go back in time, we have data back to the 70s, and the U.S. score now, not the ranking, but the score now is back where it was in the Carter administration. So all of the privatization, all the tax cutting, all of the movements towards freer trade, all the liberalization, are the people that don't like this, they call it neoliberalism, but all of the liberalization that happened under Reagan and Bush and even under Clinton, and it's all gone. We're back essentially to where we started in the United States, at least according to our index. And that's pretty doggone sad. I mean, so many people spent their lives and careers working hard to move those policies towards more economic freedom, and very short order, it all kind of withered away.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's interesting too, because it ties in, not nicely, but it ties in with what was happening, 40 years ago. I mean, we've seen the highest inflation rate since 81, which was the year that I was born. You were going back to 86 earlier.
You look good, Vance.
Yeah, thanks. But in a whole generation, right? In my lifetime, I haven't seen this sort of inflation. I haven't seen the spike in interest rates like we've seen here recently, and it brings up some. Do you buy now or do you wait? It changes a lot of behavior. I mean, as we know, economics is all about trade-offs, and the behavioral effects that these sort of things happen. We see inflation, interest rates, the labor market, everything else are kind of signals and indicators about what's happening in the economy, and it gives people a little bit of stress. I mean, I think we're seeing in depression rates going up, suicide rates, fentanyl overdoses, and things of that nature. It's not just the economics, right? I mean, we talk a lot about GDP and how is declining real economic output in the first 2 quarters and that sort of thing. And that's one indication that we can use of what's going on in the economy. But it may not necessarily tell us all about the other factors that are going on in people's lives and in their families and everything else on a day-to-day basis. I mean, you may have a really high GDP, but you still have people that are kind of suffering in the process. And I think some of what you're able to tease out with the economic freedom of the world helps to get at least part of that problem, right?
Yeah, I mean, one of the great things about having the index in place, and now, again, we have a long time series. We can go back with data to the 70s from many, many, many countries, is that we're able to actually evaluate empirically as scholars the relationship between economic freedom or capitalism or whatever you want to call it, and various social economic outcomes. Sure, we can look at GDP and GDP growth and the sort of economics kinds of variables, but you can also look at access to clean water or literacy or gender equality or a number of social indicators or inequality, economic inequality. And, the good news is I think there's been a sort of slow and maybe grudging acknowledgement on the part of scholars in this that work on economic development that economic freedom works in the sense that it provides better GDP and better growth, but it also improves a lot of social indicators of well-being, and that to the extent we care about those things as well as we care about GDP, that's good. I mentioned inequality deliberately because I think the greatest debate we have right now about this capitalism, socialism thing is about inequality. Many people believe, Thomas Piketty, the famous French economist, and many others, many people believe that if you have a capitalist or economically free system, that will engender a lot of economic inequality. And economic inequality has a lot of negatives associated with it. The stress that you mentioned earlier. The good news is, if you look at something like 50 papers now that are academic papers that have been published, the good news is it doesn't seem like economic freedom really causes any damage to equality. I want to be fair. It doesn't seem like it makes the world a lot more equal either. It's sort of the answer is like zero. Like it doesn't seem to affect it positively or negatively. It's just sort of there. But that's if that kind of scholarly finding can percolate in the scholarly world and then get taught to students and maybe make it to a couple policymakers, I think we will have this index will have done a really important and worthwhile job. Definitely, I agree. One of the things that I think we saw in 2017, 2018, 2019, kind of in that period, whenever you had the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, you had the deregulation that was going on during that time. So you think about more economic freedom that was happening. In 2019, of course, before COVID and the shutdowns and everything else, I mean, we had the lowest poverty rates on record, the highest real median household incomes. Income inequality was actually, falling during that period. And this was counter to a lot of that discussion from Piketty and others that were out there. Like, this is going to lead to more income inequality. So it's not just that we have some theory, but we have more evidence that this is going on, along with what you're finding in the economic freedom of the world. Because what you also do, what I think is great about the report, is you look at the different quartiles and say, okay, what happens to personal income with this quartile and another quartile? What are some of the results you found this time around? Yeah, so pretty much the same thing we find every time. Yeah. But if you look at GDP or GDP growth or literacy or education, what you find is that countries that are high on the index have good measures of these things. Countries that are lower on the index, we do it by quartile, top 25%. Second, third, and fourth. And you look at the top versus the bottom, like if you just look at income, and like, again, I think income might be an overrated statistic, but it's not nothing. Yeah. If you look at income, the average income in the countries in the top quarter of our index is about 8 to 9 times larger than the countries in the bottom per, income per person. If you look at inequality, it looks like a flat line. Again, inequality doesn't correlate at all with the kind of economic system you have. So if you want to attack inequality, and many people want to attack inequality with some public policies, I don't really have a good answer for those people, because I don't think we found a magic set of public policies that will deliver equality. We have found a magic set of policies that delivers prosperity, right? And that's economic freedom. Yes, yeah, definitely. And I think too about the Madam Smith's The Theory of Moral Sentiments. How people say, well, we're trying to be self-interested, and that's not necessarily the case. Is that you kind of want to be loved or loving. I like the way that Russ Roberts puts it in his book on Adam Smith, and talks a lot about the differences there and that are commonly put on Adam Smith that just wasn't necessarily the case. I mean, because if we're not being loving, right, then we're not going to have exchanges. Right. If we don't have some sort of trust in each other, then we're not going to have those same exchanges. I mean, all these things are really broken down. Yes, we have government that can uphold private property rights and have a justice system, but there's also just norms and values that we have amongst each other. Some of the times whenever I'm just driving down the road, which on 35, you've got a lot of traffic here in the Austin, Texas area. But my boys will be in the back seat, and I'll say, guys, it's interesting because when you're just driving down the road
It's like supply and demand. And they're probably like, Dad, come on, man, what are you doing? And I'm like, well, because right now, if there's too much demand for my particular lane, there's going to be more traffic. But if the lane next to me has more supply, I can shift over and go a little bit faster. But there's also a lot of trust. We're on the road every day driving, and we trust all these people around us. Now, yes, we have car insurance and stuff like that. But I mean, it's a highly dangerous situation that we're getting in this thousands of pounds vehicle and just driving around town. And just one example of all the exchanges that are taking place.
Yeah, I mean, we go to a restaurant and you take a credit card and you hand it to somebody and they disappear. Yeah. That level of social trust, by the way, it freaks out a lot of people from other countries. They're like, you let your credit card walk away? I mean, in most countries, if you leave, your credit card's never coming back, right? Right. And it's true that there are some countries that probably have more social trust than the United States, but we have a lot of social trust. Mm-hmm. And that's something that I think is developed alongside a market economy. When people have repeated economic dealings with each other, they learn to trust each other, especially when those dealings are voluntary and mutually agreeable and value creating, again, to use the buzzword. Yeah. If you go to countries where the system is more regulated, where it's always rule based, there's a bureaucrat involved in the transactions. There's always building up the trust is a lot harder. And so there's a lot of academic work. I'm an academic, so there's a lot of academic work. We actually have measures of social trust, and you're not wrong when you're driving down the road and you see a car on the right, and you've got to trust that car is not going to break the rule and come out in front of you. Well, in large parts of the world, they will, they forget the rules. They just, so
what rules?
And so you've seen traffic in the rest of the world is usually snarled up much more than ours. And I think that part of that is because we have norms and rules that we've developed over time. This government's not really involved in this. We just developed them. But that's the kind of high functioning society that we all aspire to have.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of high functioning societies, so who was number one this year?
Well, it's always the same answer so far. It's Hong Kong. Yeah. Hong Kong, we call it a country. They have their own GDP and their own money, so they run their own economic system. Yeah. So, and Hong Kong's been number one every year we've done this index, all the way back to the 70s, and it's the freest economy, the lowest taxes, the freest trade, the lowest regulations. Second is Singapore, and they're pretty much in the same orbit. What is a little bit interesting is that neither one of them are political democracies, or at least very, very good political democracies. But most of the rest of the countries in the top would be New Zealand, United Kingdom, Australia, United States. It's going to be mostly sort of liberal democracies. At the bottom, we have Venezuela. Yeah. And should mention for the audience, we don't rate North Korea. So North Korea would undoubtedly be worse on any rating system, but we don't have data for North Korea, so we don't score them. And we also don't rate Cuba. Okay. The lowest we have is Venezuela.
What about China? Where does China rank?
Well, China ranks actually in the third quartile. They're somewhere, I forget the exact number, the new number, I haven't memorized them all, but they're around 110 out of 165. And that's not very good. We have to recognize, I don't have a number for 1975 Mao's China, right after the end of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. On a scale of 10, Mao's China probably was a 1.2. Very low. And now they're like a 6, and that's below average now on the scale, but they've gone up a lot. China has liberalized tremendously, and the economic growth that the people in China have enjoyed because of that liberalization is huge. I think it's the greatest thing that's ever happened to humanity, frankly, is getting the government. Now, the government's still too powerful in China, but getting the government out of the economy in China, even to the little bit that they've done, has unleashed this extreme prosperity in China. I think a lot of people are angsting about that, but I frankly I cannot look at a world where we had 400 or 500 million people go from absolutely abject, horrible starvation poverty to now living dignified middle-class lives. Mm-hmm. That's 500 million people in like a generation and a half, 2 generations. It's the greatest thing that's ever happened to humanity.
It's about 50% more people that live in the United States.
Exactly. It's just obviously China's huge, the sheer magnitude of this, but to elevate hundreds of millions of people out of the worst poverty on earth to now living lives that are really quite enviable. Like today, large parts of the world would look at middle-class Chinese as like they would envy that living style. So it's a great thing. I realize there's political challenges. The Chinese government is evil.
Yeah.
I don't plan to go back in China, so I can say things like that.
Yeah.
But I think the government's evil and vile. But it's despite the government, and in spite of the government, it's really bad policies that the Chinese people have been able to prosper. And I think it's a great thing. We should be happy for this.
Yeah.
Not sad. With the full recognition that there are political challenges with the Chinese government.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that there are certain things that should be addressed in that area, in that space. But to your point, it's important to really understand what's happened during that period. I mean, I think too often what we hear, especially in the political class, but also in the media, is just try to blame China for a lot of the problems that maybe happened in the Rust Belt, that they took our jobs, that this liberalization over that period of time was the problem. If you think about Ross Perot's giant sucking sound with NAFTA, right. These sort of situations, it masks the true problems that I think we have here at home that we need to get right first. I mean, one of our events that we had recently at the Economic Freedom North America there at SMU, always a great event. People should check that out. But we were kind of talking about some of this and trade liberalization. And I made the point about, well, whenever you're pointing your finger at China, you've got three other fingers that are pointing back at you. What can you really do differently that I think we should be improving on by deregulating, cutting taxes, cutting government spending? That should be a key priority. And if you do that sort of thing, you're going to put yourself in a situation that's more competitive on the global market to compete with places like China, or liberalize with other types of places as well. And go through and say, okay, what do you want to do now? And things of that nature. I think they're going to be just so important in that process.
The reality is there's a very strong temptation on the part of a lot of people to look at the world in zero-sum terms, and they see China prospering, and so somehow that means we're not prospering. The reality is, I'm from Ohio. You don't have to lecture me about the Rust Belt, but the reality is the United States has benefited from China's growth. So I think we benefited from China's growth. And, I'll be blunt about it. Every time you log on Amazon, you find a consumer good made in China that you find desirable and affordable. That makes your life better off. And we should not ignore the real tangible benefits of Chinese imports in this country. I'm from Ohio. It's cost some American jobs. Those jobs are moving to other areas, biotech and services, healthcare, financial services, whatever. But doggone it, we have benefited from Chinese growth just as they've benefited from it.
Yeah, I think it's certainly something we can continue to look at. And the next thing I'd like to get into is really your book, Socialism Sucks, which kind of brings all this together. And the full title, and here it is, Socialism Sucks, Two Economists Drink Their Way Through the Unfree World. And so, what got you interested in doing this? I know you did this with your friend Ben Powell, who's at the Texas Tech Guns Up, the Free Market Institute up there. What got you into it? What's it about?
Well, your bio gave away some of it. I've written a lot of articles and books, and this is what the Economic Freedom Index report looks like. It's 170 pages like this. It's miserably boring and dull. And people like me think it's cool, but the reality is most people in the real world, not policymakers, not wonks like Van Skin, most people, they don't want to read the Economic Freedom of the World Index. They want to read and talk about stories. And so Ben and I decided to write a popular book, and we centered around the theme of us traveling to socialist and former socialist countries, and Ben and I have been known to drink an alcoholic beverage or 5 every now and then. Yeah. And so we sort of, it's Ben and Bob's sort of drunken travels. In the writing of in the lead up to write the book, we read a lot of Anthony Bourdain and P.J. O'Rourke, because those communicators in their different ways. P.J. O'Rourke is a great political satirist who sadly just died, and Anthony Bourdain, of course, the great food journalist who also sadly recently died. But they were great communicators. They were just wonderful storytellers in their respective areas. And so we decided to go on the Ben and Bob Roadshow. drink a few beers, interview some people, tell stories. And we wove in the economics. We tried to talk about the wonky stuff that economists like to talk about, the socialist calculation debate, this obscure debate between economists way back in the 1920s and 30s. We went to Russia, so we worked that in. And we also tried to tell the real history of socialism. A lot of young people today, if you listen to the polls or look at the polls, 40% of young people say they think socialism is a good idea, which is really kind of, I think, horrific, because we one of our other missions was to tell the real history and try to put a personal touch on the real history of socialism, and not just with boring statistics like we normally would do as professional economists.
Well, yeah, and I think y'all did a great job of that. It was great to hear, and as y'all were going through different places, and I thought you might want to tell a couple stories of places where y'all visited.
There's so many stories, but there's really two that stand out. The one is in Venezuela. I got a little bit angry. We went to the border town of Cucuta. It's on the Colombian Venezuelan border, and what happens there is because there's just there's no goods to be had in Venezuela now. The hyperinflation and the government controls of the economy. So people are flocking across the Venezuelan Colombian border to go to the Colombian side, and right there on the border, there's this makeshift town of shops, and you can buy rice, beans, sugar, deodorant, aspirin, diapers, car tire, everything you'd ever. It's like an outdoor Walmart bazaar. And these Venezuelans are coming over. We talked to a couple, Ana and Paulo, and they had driven 3 days from their home in Venezuela. They were obviously not peasants because they had a car, but I think Paulo said he worked in a hotel, and his town was on the other side of Venezuela. It was almost like on the Guyana or the Brazilian border. So he had driven 3 days across the country, dangerous drive now, to go to Colombia, and he was just going like to buy food for his family. So I live in Dallas, and I'm like, the closest thing I can think of is like, how bad would life have to be in Dallas for me to decide it'd be a good idea to get in my car and drive to Vancouver to go to Kroger, and that's the functional equivalent of what these people did. So it was going to be a 6-day round trip to go grocery shopping, and that was just, it angered me. It really made me. We got a little emotional, got a little bit mad. The other story is a little bit more uplifting. Vance, we were in Havana, in Cuba, and Cuba's terrible. Don't go to Cuba; it's miserable. I don't think we painted an adequate enough picture because we were drinking so much that maybe it made things look better, but truly it's awful. But we were walking up the steps of the old Grand University of Havana, which is now a crumbling bunch of rock, buildings that are falling down. We're going up these stairs, and the young man comes down the other direction, and as he passes us on the stairs, he said in very perfect English, which was unusual for Cuba, he said, "Where are you guys from?" And so I in my bad Spanish, I said, "Los Estados Unidos," and we had a nice conversation with the young fellow. It was right after President Obama had gone and had announced that the U.S. was going to liberalize some of the restrictions against Cuba. And the young man, and I swear this is a true story. He said as we were saying our goodbyes, he says, "We're so happy you Americans are coming to Cuba now, because you bring us more." And Ben and I both thought he was going to say money, and that'd be fine because we brought a lot of money and we spent a lot of money in Cuba, but he didn't say that. He said, "We're so happy you Americans are coming to Cuba because you bring us more freedom."
Wow!
And it was such a great thing for him to say, and I hope it's true. And I like everybody, I have mixed feelings about President Trump. Some things I like, some things I didn't like. But one thing I didn't like, frankly, was the undoing some of the Obama era. I think that more interaction with Cuba is more likely to bring them freedom. That's a debated point. I understand. My position, I think, is that young man on the steps of the University of Havana thought that if Americans would go visit Cuba more, and yes, bring our dollars, but that the interaction with Americans, he thought, was going to bring them more freedom. And if he had been overheard saying that might be a politically dangerous thing for him to say. Anyway, so that was so those are the sort of episodic. They're both bad places, but we had sort of a glimmer of optimism in Cuba. Unfortunately, the Venezuela story has only gotten worse since we were there.
Yeah, that's tough. And as you're bringing up those points, though, it helps to humanize it a little bit. right? Of what people are actually facing in these countries, because there is so much that's going on. And, like your point there, him just saying that there in Cuba could have him imprisoned or even worse sometimes.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I mean, again, I can show you a chart with Venezuela's economic freedom index going down. I've got the numbers in the book. But talking to Ana and Paulo, that to me, that was much more meaningful. So that was the purpose of our book, was to try to pair the boring numbers with these man on the street, women on the street stories. Because it's just like we were talking about with teaching students. They're going to learn more from the game than the lecture. Same thing here. They're going to learn more from the story than they're going to learn from our math.
Oh yeah. Well, it's going to be interesting too to see the effects that are going on. I think trying to bring some of this to the current economy of what's happening with inflation and interest rates going up, and we see the stock market going down. I was reading something earlier. I think just over the last month, a little over $7 trillion in wealth has been declined because of the stock market and everything else. It's just one thing after another. And again, going back to what are we doing here in America, that we should be trying to improve our institutions, strengthen our institutions, and part of it going, kind of humanizing it again, and the Let People Prosper way is, I think a lot of it starts with the family. I mean, we too often are being more dependent on government as being the first line of defense. I mean, they should be the last resort. And instead, they're too often the first resort when they come in. And in one larger, more macro area that we see that is with the Federal Reserve. I mean, they're coming in, printing all this money. They're coming back some now in quantitative tightening, but probably going to be too slow and take them too long to do that, to really break inflation like Volcker did back in the late 70s and early 80s. And this sort of economic way of thinking of the institutions and what matters, we need to get back to basics, back towards this direction of economic freedom, liberalization, trade liberalization, what I hope will also be immigration liberalization with a slowing and even maybe declining population. These are things that we need more of. From this classical liberal mindset that I believe we share, there's not enough talk about this. And I recently had, one of your good friends and my friend Pete Betke on, and he really dug into that topic as well. And I guess what's some of your thinking about what's going on in the economy and everything right now?
Wait, for better or worse, right now, malaise is selling. Malaise is selling clicks on Twitter, and people watch CNN. It's all bad news. Bad news always sells well because it's more fun to read about it's not more fun, but people are going to read about a bus that crashes. The bus that arrives safely to its destination is not a news article, right?
Right.
And so malaise sells. It always has been a little bit of a sexy thing for journalists and for politicians to point to. But right now we have an unusually high sort of malaise quotient. That, if you look at the American left, I guess, party-wise, the Democratic Party, I mean, it's global warming, it's inequality, all of these bad things, and their solutions are really not very uplifting. Their solutions are drive an electric car, which I don't want to drive, and or put on a sweater. The Jimmy Carter solution to energy crisis. Well, just put a sweater on. These are not optimistic policy solutions. These are pessimistic policy solutions. And if I may, I think the American right, the Republican side of the party spectrum, they're selling gloom and doom too. Oh, immigrants are taking our jobs. They're doing this. All the Chinese are, closing our factories, whatever. It's all gloom and doom. And I compare that to the message of Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan he sold optimism. And I'm desperate. I don't care if it's a Democrat or a Republican at this point. I mean, I'm just desperate for somebody in the political world to say, hey, things are good and getting better, and we can let's work together to make them better. Yeah. And here's how I think we're going to do that. It's more of an uplifting message instead of pointing fingers at this crisis or this thing that's going to kill us, or that thing's going to kill us. These people are bad. Yeah. That's the solution. And I can tell you though, I sit here in my office. It's so easy to get defensive and it's so easy to fall into the gloom and doom narrative. And I think it takes bravery for a politician. Ronald Reagan was so unique. And he wasn't a perfect politician, but
sure,
a lot of things I didn't like about Ronald Reagan too. But all politicians, but he at least understood that optimism, it's a risky strategy, but it's a strategy that can separate you from the pack. And Obama wasn't bad at this. I got to throw him a little bone here. He wasn't bad about trying to see a silver lining to whatever the crisis du jour was, and I think that's what made him a good politician. But the default position for journalists, the default position for a lot of voters, the default position for politicians is gloom and doom, finger pointing, and that's not going to help. No. That's not going to get us towards the world I think that we want to have for ourselves and our children.
Well, I think there's a lot of truth to that, Bob, and it's what I'm trying to do a lot more on the Let People Prosper show is to bring about the optimism that's out there. One of the other things that's kind of connected to the economic freedom of the world is economic freedom of North America, and have the states. And I think one of the things that will be important right now as Washington is broken, and even if the Republicans likely take the House, we'll see what happens in the Senate, but we're going to have a split Congress. The Biden administration is likely to put out a lot of executive orders that are going to go out. I think they're testing it right now with a student loan kind of redistribution scheme and stuff that's going on. But there's probably more of those that are going to go out. And I think it's going to be important, imperative, really, for states to withstand whatever's coming out of Washington to bring about more economic freedom. I mean, we're blessed to live in Texas, but Texas has a lot of problems too. We have a high property tax system, which is really funded by a lot of local government spending that's too high, that we need more rules in place, I think, of spending limits and things of that nature. But they're also too high of occupational licensing, for example, to start a business and being an entrepreneur and things of that nature. And so when we're looking, whether it be at the world or at the states or even at the local government, it's really got to be a first step is how do we make people most free? How do we preserve liberty, not impede it, not even really to try to enhance it into so much as to say that just get out of the dang way. Right. Yeah. Just get out of my way a lot of times.
Yeah, the title of your podcast is great. And they always teach us don't use the passive voice, but let people prosper is a little bit passive. But that's actually the correct voice that you want to use. I mean, you saw this, I mentioned this China. All the Chinese government was get out of their way. Yeah. And people prospered. Yeah. It's not actually a difficult recipe. Just get out of the way. Let them build the business. Let them build the apartment complex. Let them be a funeral parlor director without a license. Just let people do what they want to do. Let them work. Yeah. And you don't have to do anything affirmatively. You just gotta not do a lot of bad things. So the passive voice is actually, again, contrary to most English teachers who teach us how to use it, is precisely the right way to phrase it.
Yeah, well, I think so. And Bob, thank you for all that you do. Thank you for being a guest here on the Let People Prosper show. And I look forward to continuing to read the Economic Freedom of the World Index. Maybe there'll be a Socialism Sucks Part 2. We'll see. But thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Vance. It's a lot of fun talking to you always.
All right. Have a good one. Thank you for joining us on the Let People Prosper show. Please join us again on the next one. Have a prosperous day.